Now we'll hear the ancient word. He called, and it's from Mark 8:34-38 in the New Testament. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Thus ends the reading from the scripture. And a contemporary word from Thomas C. Nelson from the church archives. "There are lots of folks here in Mill Valley who'd like to belong to a church, but they have their own ideas about God and about the Bible. They don't want to subscribe to a whole set of fixed interpretations about religion. Maybe they want to be free to change their minds once in a while." Thus ends the reading.
May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. That's how every sermon began when I was a young person. The minister confessing that they might not get it all right, and yet they would speak from their heart. Now we're playing with context here. It's 2024. We're looking back to 1924. You heard Thomas Nelson, one of the founders, say, we want to be free to change our minds. And this is what their first minister said. "The group who hired me told me that they would not agree in advance to believe anything I said. But it was understood that I must say what I believed, regardless of their possible disagreement with me. They lived up to that charter for the 16 years I was their pastor." We've been talking a bit about what was called modern theology. It's the wave of theological thinking that was coming through the end of the 19th century and certainly propelled some of the members of our church in those early years. And really, in many respects, we are still in modern theology, although we've been free to change our minds about certain things. Things like God having a gender, things like that. Many other things too. It's a time of great change in the churches. That last half of the 19th century, many different religious movements emerged. And part of that was people starting to say, maybe church doesn't have to be the way it has been. And that's part of what led to the founding of our church. Because it was called a community church, and that meant you didn't have to subscribe to one creed or another. The church wasn't going to have a creed, but was going to welcome all kinds of Christians, and even curious people who didn't know whether they were Christians or whether they might become Christians. Now, our passage today is a challenging one, isn't it? take up their cross and follow me. Those who want to save their life will lose it. One person said to me, it's a terrible passage. Our Bible study said, well, it's not that bad. But we can't always understand it. Or if we do understand it, we think, does it really mean that? I remembered something that Mark Twain said. It ain't the parts of the Bible that I can't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I do understand. And I think that's part of what it is with this passage. This is a passage that suggests to us, with our 21st century minds, that we need to deny ourselves, that we need to deny our own wants, our own ambitions, our own goals, our own ideas about how our lives should go, and simply follow Jesus. And it means that if there's something difficult in our lives, perhaps that's just our cross to bear. And I went back and read some biblical commentaries from the early 20th century. And indeed, that was one of the major things that they were saying, that what this passage says is that it's not what you want that matters. It's devoting yourselves to following Jesus, whatever that means, and that you need to be ready to give up any aspect of your life in order to follow Jesus. And it means that if your husband beats you, or if you have an illness, or if your child dies, that's just your cross to bear. Well, let me just say right up front that that certainly isn't what this passage meant in its original setting. We talked in the Bible studies this week about, well, what is this cross that they pick up? And in that time, in the Roman Empire, crucifixion was the way that Rome punished rebels, poor people, slaves who disobeyed. And picking up your cross in that setting meant that you had to carry the crossbeam up to the place where you would be crucified. It's calling to mind an excruciating death. It's calling to mind a punishment that may be so over the top compared to whatever violation you might or might not have committed. Because certainly the courts were not set up in order to give justice. So I think we can safely understand that cross here is a metaphor. We'll talk about what it is in a minute, because it talks about saving your life and losing your life. Well, we are, in our 21st century North America, individualists. When we think of ourself, who are we? We think of ourself as an individual, free to make choices, to move beyond where we grew up, move beyond our parents, our grandparents, move beyond aspects of the culture that seem outdated to us. But in those times, you were not an individual. You were a member of an extended family. You were part of a household overseen by the patriarch, the oldest man, or at least the oldest man who had his wits and powers about him. That was your life. And without that household, without that family, you couldn't survive. And your role in that household was to play the role assigned to you. If you were male or female, it might be different. If you were young or old, it might be different. If you were the oldest son or the youngest son, it might be different. So your purpose in life was to fulfill your role to make sure that the family achieved what it needed to achieve to support all the members. And so what's being said here is that in order to save your life, that is, to follow Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, you need to leave your family and follow Jesus and do the commandments that he brings forth. And we know what they are. We don't let a child go to bed hungry or cold. We don't let someone who is ill suffer without care. If someone is imprisoned, we visit them. And in fact, in those days, you had to take them their food. If someone doesn't have a home, we seek to provide it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus is teaching these really quite understood concepts within the Jewish tradition. These were what the Jews had in their tradition, and yet there were hungry people around them. There were people without clothing, people unjustly imprisoned or even justly imprisoned and seriously suffering. There were people who were dying without anyone to help them with pain or facing an illness without providing the care needed. So this passage is talking about joining the community of Jesus, the followers of Jesus who are building a new community of mutual care, of mutual support, and also dedicated to care and support for others. Whereas most families, their major aims and efforts would be to go toward providing the food and clothing and shelter that the people in the family needed. They would grow their crops, they would put up their buildings or mend their buildings. The women would be constantly spinning yarn in order to produce at least one garment for everyone. Instead of your obligations to that family, your obligations become the obligations of the Jesus family. There's an anthropological term here. It's called fictive kinship. And I think we intuitively know what that fictive kinship means, because many of us have moved far from where we grew up, far from our parents. We don't live in the same village as our parents. We don't live with the extended family of our spouse. We don't stay in one vicinity. We move. And so wherever we move, wherever we go, we build up circles of friendship, of mutual support and care. And that's kind of what this church is. It's a church that it doesn't say, believe this and you can be a follower of Jesus. It says, do this. Come and be part of us. Now, even in the last 100 years, our understanding of cultures and of human cultures change. We would no longer say to a woman who is being abused, that's your cross to bear. Nor would we say to a hungry child, feed yourself. Nor would we say to someone sick, I'm sorry you don't have health insurance. Wait a minute, we do these things as a culture, don't we? We do put people in prison for endless years for small things without the support that they would need to come back into a community and create a new life, a good life, to return to their families. So our understanding changes, but for a Christian, not enough. If we have a belief that children should not go hungry, then we support whatever community programs will provide food. And those programs funded from every level of government and from contributions, voluntary contributions from members of the community. Yet we do hear voices that would like to reduce the amount of support that we give to people. We still think that people should have housing. And yet we know that the market economy as constructed can't provide enough housing. When the US government 40 years ago stopped funding the construction of new public and low-income housing and said the market will take care of it, it was the beginning of that slide that we've been on ever since. Of course, there were always people without housing in our communities, but we've seen the dramatic rise. People who, because they had a doctor's bill, had to choose whether to buy medicine or pay the rent. We know that a Christian doesn't support this way of providing housing. You know, our understanding of human psychology has also changed in the last 100 years. We understand now that people are shaped by their context, by how they grow up, by the experiences they have, the educations they have, the ways they are treated in the wider world. Now, 2,000 years ago, the psychology of a person living within an extended family was very different. You weren't expected to cultivate your own desires, your own initiatives, your own goals. That wasn't part of how a person lived. But we've become, as a society, not only individualistic, as we were already, at least in the US, by the early 20th century, not entirely, of course, but we've advocated this kind of hyper-individualism that, you know, I had a student once say to me, well, I always figured that, you know, if I can't make it in the profession, that's my problem. Not that access to jobs may be structured in such a way that if you don't know someone, or if you look different or have a different culture from the majority of employees in a company, you just might not get a position there, regardless of your skills. So we've been accentuating and saying to individuals, you must be responsible for everything about your life. It's not what Christians say. Christians say that everyone is our neighbor. And if we love our neighbor, we look out for them. We shape systems and structures so that everyone has a place. Well, I think in a lot of ways our church is in the same place it was when it was founded 100 years ago. Because especially after COVID, we are again growing ourselves into what kind of church will we be in this decade, these decades to come. We are looking ahead, we're hoping, we're dreaming. We're saying, what do we need? And why are we here? And what is our purpose as a community? And in some ways, I think we've begun to think small. Now, I have to say, the founding group was larger than our congregation is today. partly because many of them came from another church, the Congregational Church, and many of them were relatively new to Mill Valley, and they hadn't found themselves a church. And it was a small town, and people kind of knew who each other were. And it was a city trying to develop itself. Well, today, we still have all the riches around us, the amazing natural the parks, the hillsides, Mount Tam. We still have this feeling of being surrounded, of being held by beauty. And we still have many people who are seeking to grow their lives, to meet their purposes. And we still have many people who are looking for a community where they can share in that mutual appreciation and celebration and care. And actually, something is happening here. I was saying this in the spring. You might remember if you were here that we've had a number of new people come to our congregation, people who worship with us here in the sanctuary and online on Zoom. We've had people join the church. We've had new members of our board of directors, and our Christian life team is gathering steam. We've even got a concert coming up. We have this amazing play. I mean, you can laugh, maybe you're in it and you think, oh, it's not that amazing. But believe me, watching from my semi-outside perspective, I don't have a part in the play, I don't come to the rehearsals, I didn't write it. I think about it. There's a large group of people here who are creating something new together. And I think that's what we are doing, what we're about. And one of the things I do wonder then is, are we invisible to others? Do we make ourselves known? Do we go from village to village or street to street, as Jesus and his followers would? How do we use the networks of today with computers and social media, newspapers and advertisements? Let's ask ourselves, how did I find this place? How did I find this place? And how can I help others find this place, which has come to mean so much to me and to all of us? So I don't think it's a terrible passage. I think it's actually not one of the ones that Mark Twain could have said that he understood it, because we don't understand it when we first read it. But when we understand that Jesus is saying, come and be part of something new, something that really takes to heart the primary teachings of our religious tradition, to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Let's put that at the front. When we think about that, maybe it reminds us not only why we're here, but what it is that we're seeking. That sense of a larger purpose in life, a community that has a larger purpose. Well, before I repeat myself somehow, before I say something that is more than was needed, I'm watching my watch. Before that, I just want to say that it makes me so happy to have a church full of people and a screen full of people who are engaging each other, sharing these times and sharing these hopes and dreams. Yeah, one of those things that Jesus wanted to bring was joy, and that's definitely here for me. Joy. Amen.